Okay, everybody, we are now working on assignment 5 here in this video. And in assignment 5, what we are looking for is intentionality about where you're placing the subject within the frame of a photograph. And honestly, the technical aspects of photography are ones that to some degree we can overlook a little bit because our cameras do have automation, and if you're struggling with some of the technical features on there, there's kind of workarounds and shortcuts and so forth. But on the other hand, when it comes to creating great images in a very repeatable way, I think the most important skill you can learn here is aesthetic skill or compositional skill, as we're referring to it in this assignment here. So there's lots of little different tools that you can use and different ways that you can compose images, and we listed them all out in this assignment. So we'll look at some of your photos here and discuss them in terms of composition and probably overlooking the technical aspects of them a little bit here. So with that, we'll get started here with Kenny's first image. So this image is a demonstration of scale here. So we have the huge mountain in the background and presumably this little tree in the foreground here. I gotta honestly say that I sort of had to look pretty hard to find that tree, and if the scale is what we're really hoping for here to emphasize the scale between the two, I think we need to see a little bit more of that. And so I would do an adjustment that would make that area lighter. So I've gone in, created a new adjustment layer, I've lightened it, and then I'm going to invert it, and then we can basically paint that layer back on. And in doing so, now we sort of have this little bit brighter foreground. Just went over a little bit there. That, I feel like the little tree in the foreground that's kind of almost like a lonely tree in the pasture there becomes just a little bit clearer to me. So, yeah, the scale is there, but I think that we need something a little bit more obvious in the foreground here. Not something that we have to hunt for. Now, within this image, though, I see a lot of great things going on. So, one of the things here, I think we've got a lot of negative space or empty space, and I'm almost feeling like, I want to crop this image like that. And I think that's, there's not a lot of information in that image, but I think it's seen in a very different way and not sort of like the cliche mountain volcano way that we might sort of see things typically. I also love, and I know it's kind of off in the distance here, but I love this little landscape that's happening in the shadows there. Again, it gets a little bit pixelated there, but I think you guys get the idea. I feel, again, when we're working with using scale, we want two pretty relatable objects that are obvious in the frame. So I want you to work on that a little bit, Kenny. And then this image is color, and certainly we've got this bright red that is jumping out off the page at us. I guess, again, my tendency is to want to crop these images a little bit tighter. In this instance, maybe something like this kind of gets me a little bit more excited. And I think my eye is a little bit more directly attracted to that color there. When we kind of back off like this, certainly the color is there, but it seems like it's almost in the distance, and we're being almost overwhelmed by the the water here, and this picture almost feels like it's as much about the texture and the surface of the water and the trees and so forth than anything else. I'm also kind of fascinated by this little vignette that's going on right there. Also think that you've got something interesting going on there. But again, probably similar to the previous image, I just feel like, there's too much there. We want to tighten up a little bit, simplify a little bit, and be a little bit more obvious about what it is that we're trying to attract the viewer to. And then last image here, this one is repeating patterns, and I guess the repeating patterns are the two mountains here. I gotta say that it's probably the least successful of the three images that you show me. There's just really nothing there. Where does our eye go to? What is the interesting thing? I'm just not seeing anything there that I really would be compelled to look at in sort of a deeper and more thorough way here. Again, I just think you're shooting stuff way too far away. Something like that I think becomes a little bit more interesting crop, and then that boat in the at the harbor there, or whatever that is, then that becomes maybe an interesting detail that our eye can go to. But again, here we've just got so much water, and the water, really there's not a super interesting or super compelling characteristic to the water in this spot. We put this boat right here in the foreground here, then I think maybe we've got a little bit stronger image out of the group. The other thing I just wanted to talk about here a little bit with you is if we go into the file info and we take a look at these images, looks like these images were created about 2 years ago. So for this class, I just want to re-emphasize to everybody that you need to be creating images new for the class for each assignment. And also, I really would prefer that you didn't use iPhones. We've got some great DSLRs up in the Media Center, and there's no charge to sign them out. So while you have those at your disposal, I hope you would kind of take advantage of that. So Kenny, a few things to focus in on here. A little bit tighter on your subject, a little less busy. Direct the viewer more intentionally towards the subject of the frame. And last and not least, of course, we need you to shoot new photos for your assignments. So please get out there, do the work, and certainly you will see the grades will follow along with the work. So next up we have Brianna's work. So we'll start out with a diagonal line image. And the quad is certainly a great place for capturing diagonal lines. And certainly you've got a really nice diagonal line here, and it without question sort of draws the eye through the frame all the way up to this crucifix that is at the corner of the chapel there. The only thing that I wonder about, though, with this image is sort of all the interesting stuff that's happening is in this, like, 1/5 right half side of the photo. And the other 4/5 of the image really is kind of dead space that, really there's nothing interesting going on in there. So, I think, maybe the way this image needs to appear is, perhaps something like this with a little bit tighter crop on that diagonal line and eliminating some of this stuff here. And, the other thing here, Brianna, is as we build a level of sophistication in our imagery, we want to try to take photographs that are not common. And I feel like, if you're walking across the quad on any given day, pretty much everybody would see this photograph and very much see it in this fashion. So I think as you become more sophisticated in your image making, you have to find subject matter that is fresh and new for the viewer. And if you are going to shoot something like this, a place that gets a lot of traffic a lot of time, either have to shoot it at a time when the light is particularly interesting, or when the colors are particularly vivid or different, or perhaps even some sort of activity is going on in there that lends itself to a unique view of this. I'm not so sure any of those things are here now. It just kind of feels like you're almost walking across the quad and just sort of pointing and snapping. So work on that, and really try to keep in the back of your mind that we want to take images that are different than what are just common views of things would be, our common ordinary views. So here's your second image, negative space. Boy, this is a fantastic shot. Really love this shot a lot. Looks like, maybe in the library, some books, certainly all things that are common and have been shot before, but you really shoot them in a very different kind of way because you isolate the shapes in there. You give us a lot of empty open space, which, appropriately enough, you've called it a negative space image. And also, I think the image is very aesthetically appealing because you've broken it down into a lot of shapes. And our brain is attracted to shapes and patterns and stuff like that. And, we've got lots of different shapes, and, even, gosh, we could start playing around with this image and, do a whole bunch of different stuff here. We've got a really cool pattern going on right here, some cool shapes going on there. And, for my money, even just the emptiness of this panel right here is somewhat interesting and different for me. So I think, this is a good image to compare to your previous one, where, both images were taken in areas that see a lot of people and a lot of people are there, but this one just is so much more thoughtfully composed, and I think it offers a view and a vantage point that is kind of unique and different, and maybe one that we could say is a bit more creative than the previous one. And then your last image, what I really love about this shot is the backlighting that's going on. One of the things that you didn't have to do for the assignment here, but we did talk about in the discussion, was the idea of the different directions light can come from. And certainly in this case, the light is coming from the window, so it's backlighting these chairs. And I think your choice of black and white here works really well, because black and white does tend to emphasize shapes and patterns. And I think you've got both shape and pattern going on in these chairs here. So I think that's pretty cool. I think, maybe if I was to play around with this image a little bit, I might be looking to bring a little bit more detail into what's going on in the window there. And then I might look to lighten up the foreground here with the chairs and so forth, maybe something like that. But again, that's kind of a minor thing, and I think that perhaps it's something, is more of an aesthetic issue of personal taste rather than something that we can say is wrong with the photo. So with that being said, nice job on this one. I think this and your negative space one are your real two strong winners of the group. So just work on that diagonal line one, and make sure that your lines are very obvious, and that they do lead us to something that is visually interesting. So next up we have Zoe's images, and so for the first shot we've got the framing technique being used, and certainly that's pretty obvious here with the two windows that sort of frame the windows of the buildings across the road or outside there. So that certainly is an example of that. Although, I love to kind of start cropping around and tightening up things and maybe finding hidden details in photographs that might not be obvious at first glance. And one thing that I kind of found super interesting over here, if we just simplify this image down to some of like the patterns and the reflections, so the patterns and the texture in the tile on that roof and the reflection in the window here, I think that's a different way of seeing things. Maybe a little bit on the abstract side, but also perhaps the idea that the more we simplify images, the more compelling that they can become. So that's not to say your framing shot doesn't work here, because I do think it's a really successful shot. The other thing that you don't talk about here, you talk about balance in one of your other images, but in this image, I think we definitely have some symmetrical balance with the two windows here and the reflections in there. It's very calm, it's very tranquil. So I almost feel like there should be some like a string quartet playing in the piazza below or something like that, just because of that visual balance that you've developed in this photo. Next image, you went to black and white on this, which certainly, black and white without question emphasizes shapes and forms and lines. I mean, it really breaks photos down into their formal elements, and it certainly does that. We really start to see the brush strokes in the wall here, and also the squares and rectangles and triangles that are in this little model ship here. I love the fact that you've included so much empty space in here, and again, you don't call this a negative space image, but I think this negative or empty space that you have going on here is super interesting, and kind of elevates this image up from what very easily could be a very common kind of photograph. So really love the composition in here and your use of empty negative space. And then last but not least, you have asymmetrical balance in here. Yeah, absolutely. We've just got so many different things going on here, from the rectangle of this frame, and even the fact that the frame isn't shot in a way that it's perfectly square. It's kind of like a quirky off-centered shape to it, where the lower left-hand corner of it is kind of extended out a bit more into the frame. So that adds to sort of that quirky, fun nature of the photo. I guess if I was to refine this image a little bit, and really it comes down to personal tastes in terms of where you're willing to go with Photoshop. But for me, I'm not so crazy about the radiator in the background, and so I might consider just blasting that out using a cloning technique, or really there's 1,000 different ways you can do this in Photoshop. But at the end of the day, essentially what I think I want is just to get rid of that radiator or heater in the background, and hopefully you'll agree with me that that's a pretty neat image. I could easily see this image appearing in like a home decor magazine, or home improvement magazine or something like that. So really like this a lot. So good job on these, Zoe. I think you're well on your way here to putting together a really good series of images for your final portfolio. So keep up the good work. And next up we have Adalberto's images. And to start things out, we've got an image that simplifies the frame, and yeah, certainly we've definitely got that going on here. A lot of empty space up in the sky, and I really love this little detail of smoke that's kind of rising from the buildings. And honestly, you got a lot of different compositional things going on in here. Clearly we're seeing pattern here, which I think is great, and also love the shadowing that is giving us a sense of 3 dimension and texture. I just probably, if I was to make one little refinement on this image, I think I might just tighten it up a little bit, forget about the edge of the bridge over there, and I think I probably would even, get rid of a bunch of the waterfront in the foreground too, and just drop that really low, so we have just the repetition of the pattern of the buildings and that little smoke going on in the sky. I'm just kind of zooming in here and kind of looking through there, and yeah, pretty neat shot. Even the more I look at this, I'm almost wondering if I'm even willing to just totally get rid of the water entirely and do it just like that, because I think that's a pretty interesting shot in and of itself like that. And then your diagonal line image. This one's a pretty obvious one. We've got the diagonal line. It leads across the river here. I guess the thing that I would just say about this, kind of feels like a cliche photo to me. It seems like every bridge shot we see has sort of the same compositional element to it. So while there's really nothing wrong with the photograph, I don't think it kind of stands out as much as this image, especially when we kind of start messing around with the cropping in that image. So, you've definitely done what you needed to do for this assignment, but, would I say this is a portfolio image? Probably not. And then last but not least, your pattern image. Again, very interesting, first of all, what you've got going on here with that smoke and that steam or whatever that is coming out from underneath those 4 canister-like, I don't know what those are, smokestacks or, whatever the case is. But certainly the pattern that's going on there is really interesting. You guys probably are getting to the point where you can predict what I'm going to do here. And, I think in this instance, maybe I'm thinking that, again, a tighter crop might present us with just a little bit more focused image on just what's happening and perhaps what's visually interesting there. So, just a thought on this, but all in all, again, a nice image and certainly well seen, and well seen especially from the perspective of just finding something that is new and different, and especially bridges get shot all the time, so adding that little extra element of something to the bridge here I think really helps out. So good job with these. Again, I think you are in good position here. You got a good grasp on everything we've talked about so far, so just keep up the good work, and just try to be really creative with your images, and you should be in great shape here. So next up we have PJ's images here. And first shot is the car, and kind of got it on a diagonal angle, and you've converted it to black and white. I think, it's pretty neat, your explanation. I really love the statement that you wrote about this, and sort of talking about the dualistic nature of a car, how they've, made life so convenient for us, and they're, kind of these modern marvels that have changed society, but, also sort of the darker side of cars, that the damage to the environment that they've done, and so forth. So I like the idea, and I especially like the concept behind the idea, which is written very eloquent in your statement there. The one thing here, though, and again, I don't know if it's just a matter of you embedding this in a PDF or what, but the image looks really, really pixelated in here, and it doesn't look in super sharp focus. So, maybe that's something that gets corrected once we get a chance to look at the JPEGs on there. So, second image of the lawnmower. What I really love about this, it looks like you've kind of gotten down in a little bit lower vantage point. So I think this is sort of a perspective that the viewer almost feels like that they're part of the lawnmower and seeing the view that the lawnmower sees. And certainly love these diagonal lines that just sort of push all of our visual energy into the frame and add to the momentum there. And then, last but not least, this great shadow that's falling behind it. Again, I think that is something that deals with light that we talked about in this module. It wasn't necessarily something that we had to do for the assignment, but I think in this image it does really add a sense of depth and dimension. It because of the shadows in here, not only this shadow but also this shadow here, this image feels like it's very three-dimensional and very deep, rather than feeling like it's flat. So really good job on this. And then the last image, the series of chairs. In your reflections on this image, you talk about it being an image that is about line, which, certainly there's lots of lines going on here, and they're lined up in a line. But I feel like this image is almost as much about pattern as it is about line, and the thing that is really visually compelling to me is just sort of how these are all lined up in kind of a uniform fashion. And again, the fact that they're empty invites the viewer to almost come and visually sit in them. So I really like the sort of the vantage point you take on all your images. I think you have an awareness of the viewer and what the viewer is going to do in response to the image. So I like that a lot, and I definitely want to encourage you to keep doing that. Of course, the one thing here, just I hate to pound the drum, but I need to see your images in JPEGs rather than in PDFs. So make sure you do that for the upcoming assignments. And then last but not least, we have Alexis's images. And so the first shot, we have color going on here. And, I really like the fact that you've recognized this sort of orangish cast that between the light and probably the silt in the creek is contributing to give that really interesting color to it. So that definitely contrasts wickedly with this really bright, almost saturated green that's in the background. The other thing that I think is going on in this image that's really visually compelling is the S curve that's going on. So you kind of take our eye through the frame, sort of back and forth there. And I think when you do that, that can become super interesting for the viewer to see. I also like this image because this is another one of these where we can, kind of start zooming in and maybe take a little bit of an abstract look at an image by kind of eliminating all of the exterior context and just sort of isolating shapes and patterns and textures and shadows. And in this case, I think it works really good for this. You look at this on first glance, it's kind of like, okay, what is this? Versus this image, it's pretty obvious that this is a stream, and in fact, anybody that's been over the forest lawns probably even recognize this as a stream. So there's two different ways you can go here. I think each has its own merits, and certainly this is a strong image, but also I kind of like the idea of just isolating in on those textures and colors and shadows in there as perhaps maybe a little bit more of a creative approach to it. And then the black and white image, this is great. We've talked about over and over again here how black and white tends to bring emphasis to shapes, and certainly this heart is clearly a shape here. For all of you guys working with black and white, I really want you to be aware that black and white should almost always have some extreme blacks, some extreme whites, and some middle grays. This image kind of feels a little bit hung up in lots of middle grays without having any pure whites. And you say to me, oh gosh, well Tom, there's pure white right in there. And if we take the our paintbrush tool and just go in there and paint some some pure white in there, you can see, gosh, that really isn't pure white at all. And when we go into our levels adjustments, we see here in our levels, this whole spot here, this is where pure white exists, right over here on our levels adjustment. And the beginning of where information starts in this photo is like, a quarter of the way into that histogram. So basically, what we can do here with the levels adjustment is just push to where pure white starts and have that start right where the information begins in the image. And then I think now you start to have an image that's got a little bit more black, that really wicked black and white pop that I think, really beautiful, elegant black and white images have. And certainly I'd even consider playing around with this image a little bit more by trying to separate some of these tones in this spot here. And I know you're looking at that right now and you're saying, okay, Tom's kind of losing it a little bit, but this is how I end up building photographs. We start making adjustments and then maybe removing some of those adjustments in very specific areas of the photograph. So doing that, and I think that sort of really jumps out at me and has that really, I like to call it a rich feeling of a traditional black and white photograph. Whereas we go this way, it almost feels a little bit of on the dark and flat side of things. But all that being said, I think really, really well seen photograph and good composition in all of that. And then last but not least, here's your straight lines. Honestly, Alexis, I think, we've got straight lines going on here, but I think the dominant line in this photograph is this right here that is kind of drawing us down. And that's really more of a diagonal line. And just think of it in these terms. Diagonal lines tend to be more active. They tend to be, more visually moving. And straight lines tend to be a little bit more on the quiet, somber side. And, just for me, I feel like, my eye moves rapidly down here. And I know it's kind of like an empty, isolated place, but it feels with these diagonal lines like there's some sort of, energy present here that might not necessarily match the environment or the feeling or the mood of this sort of quiet place in the cemetery. So, there's definitely straight lines there, and I certainly can understand why you'd include those in there. But I think probably it's a little bit more of a diagonal line and a very active diagonal line for that part. And I do have to say that probably out of all the images, I think this one's the least compelling from the point of view. Again, this is one of those places that sort of, because it is a very architecturally famous spot that, people go here all the time and they see it from this perspective. So I think if you're going to shoot something like this, you've got to take a little bit of a different approach to it, a different vantage point, different framing, shoot it when the light is really beautiful, something like that, just to kind of take it out of the realm of being the common photograph that everybody has. So compositionally, I think you understand what we're doing here. Just a couple little refinements here, and I think that'll just pop your photography up sort of to the next level here. So keep that in mind, and look forward to seeing everybody's images coming up in the last week here, where we've now got our final project on our doorstep. So with that, I will close this out, and certainly if anybody has any questions or wants to continue the discussion on any of the points I made here, feel free to shoot me an email or post something in the module. So we'll see you in the next video.